2023 Fashion Trends and Predictions. It's officially a new year, which means it's time for our annual video where we predict upcoming fashion trends. 2023 marks our third installment of this series, and I've got to admit, I'm pretty pleased with our success rate so far, so make sure to check out the other videos to see how right we were. What's important to understand about trend predictions of any sort is that they don't come out of thin air. Trends begin with innovators and are then picked up by early adopters, and this is the group of people who wind up influencing others. As the trend gains more attention and traction, it's eventually accepted by the early majority and then the late majority, which signifies that it has become truly mainstream. The trends that we'll be discussing in today's video are in their early phases, but that doesn't mean they're totally non-existent. So yes, there's a possibility you're already familiar with them, but for the most part, they've yet to be fully embraced by the public. We've said it before, but the most important thing that you need to know when it comes to fashion is that it's cyclical. And while the 20-year rule still holds true, many of the trends we'll be talking about today have been popular at other points in history as well. The 2020s have taken a lot of inspiration from the 2000s, hence the current popularity of a more is more style of dressing, which includes loud patterns, extreme layering, and bold accessories. Besides this, we've also been influenced by the 1960s and 70s, but in 2023 we'll begin to see more inspiration from the decades surrounding them. As always, even if the trends that we mention in this video do wind up becoming popular, you are under absolutely no obligation to wear them. And many of the things that we've discussed in past installments of this series are still incredibly trendy. So think of this video as more of an addition instead of a revision. Under no circumstances should you be throwing out everything in your closet in preparation for these upcoming trends. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's get into it. The Bohemian Revival. Starting off with a more general prediction, this year will mark the return of the boho chic trend, which takes its name from bohemianism. The movement first began in the early 1900s when young adults began leading unconventional lifestyles in order to further musical, artistic, literary, or spiritual pursuits. This alternative mindset continued to pop up at other points in time during the 20th century, including 1940s hipsters and 1950s beatniks, but bohemianism is considered to have reached its peak in the 1960s and 1970s. These decades were significant in regard to their counterculture movements, with more and more people developing anti-establishment sentiments, which eventually culminated in the hippie subculture. Hippies of the time listened to psychedelic music, practiced nonviolence, embraced the sexual revolution, and experimented with drugs, all of which wound up influencing their fashion choices. This unique and unconventional style of dressing made hippies instantly recognizable to one another, while also allowing them to publicly declare their nonconformist values. The hippie movement had a major effect on pop culture of the time, influencing music, films, literature, and the arts, and it's considered to have become mainstream in the early 1970s. Hippies of the time purposely emulated clothing found in cultures that were treated as less than by others, and Native American, Latin American, African, and Asian motifs were incorporated into hippie fashion. Because the hippie movement was in defiance of corporations and consumerism, most of their clothing was purchased secondhand or handmade, resulting in a more casual and comfortable look that spoke to their individuality. During the late 1970s, there was a renewal of patriotic sentiment following the end of the Vietnam War. And combined with other socioeconomic changes, the mainstream media lost interest in the hippie movement. In the 1990s, hippie sentiments and style made a return, but with a distinctive grunge influence which incorporated plaid, lace, and leather, as well as a slightly darker color palette. Dubbed boho chic by magazines, the return of bohemian style in the 2000s is often credited to Sienna Miller, who had skyrocketed to fame in 2004 after entering a relationship with Jude Law, and her laid-back yet fashionable style of dressing led many publications to begin referring to her as an it girl. Stylist Rachel Zoe was also credited for popularizing the trend, with her clients like Nicole, Lindsay Lohan, Misha Barton, and the Olsen sisters all wearing boho-inspired looks. By 2005, the trend was everywhere, with women all over the world wearing embroidered tunics, bandanas, bell-bottoms, large belts, oversized vests, boots, and hobo bags. Although it died down in the late 2000s, elements of hippie and bohemian style, like flower crowns, fringe, and westernized kimonos, became a staple of 2010's festival fashion. Differing from its bohemian roots, the 21st century take on the trend was an example of consumerism and conformity, with people caring little about the lifestyle and more about the look itself. You'll notice that some of the elements associated with bohemian and hippie fashion have made a return in recent years, but not necessarily all in one outfit. So 2023 will mark the return of boho from head to toe. Eyelet lace. A little different from your usual lace, broderie anglaise, aka English embroidery, was a popular motif in the 19th century, being included on women's undergarments and children's clothing for decades. Characterized by a pattern of holes which are cut out of the fabric, known as eyelets, the technique saw a resurgence in popularity in the 1970s, in large part because of the Edwardian revival in fashion, which brought petticoat-inspired skirts and dresses into the mainstream. With the 90s taking so much inspiration from the 1970s, it should hardly surprise you that eyelet lace had another comeback which lasted until the mid-2000s. Besides the 1970s being incredibly influential on fashion in the 2020s, the return of eyelet lace feels like a natural progression considering the popularity of the coquette and cottagecore aesthetics, and broderie anglaise feels more sweet and rustic than traditional lace. Large bags. Smaller bags have been trending for the last few years now, with cult favorites like the Fendi Baguette, Prada Nylon, and Dior Saddlebag fully making a 2020s comeback. But things will soon start to move in the other direction, with larger bags once again coming into style, much like they did in the mid to late 2000s. Aside from following the trend cycle, I owe this size shift to the recent rise of tote bags, which have made it impossible to ignore just how inconvenient our teeny tiny purses have been. Long denim skirts. Micro mini skirts like the ones from Diesel and Miu Miu have had a chokehold on 2022. And while that tiny length will continue to remain popular because of the early 2000s influence, we're also going to see the return of longer denim skirts, which were more of a mid to late 2000s trend. 1960s hippies are often credited with the invention of the denim skirt, having DIY'd the garment out of their old jeans. In the 1970s, they hit the mainstream and have remained a fashion staple ever since, with its silhouette changing over the years. In 2023, we'll be seeing a variety of long denim skirts, with some being more fitted and others more flared. The trend will start off simply enough with blue wash denim, but once it's gotten popular, you'll be seeing them in different colors, bedazzled, and even embroidered. Handkerchief hems. Made up of panels that fall in points, like the corners of a handkerchief, this hemline was a mainstay of the 2000s, appearing on both skirts and shirts, and I've honestly been waiting for its return. The 2000s took a decent amount of inspiration from the 1920s, hence the popularity of the drop waist and emphasis on a straighter silhouette, and handkerchief hems were also popular during that time period. The 1920s are known for their short dresses, but as the 1930s neared and longer lengths became more fashionable, handkerchief hems were used for the transition, and the style was especially popular for evening wear, where it became the middle ground between the stuffy gowns of the past and the short flapper dresses. With the popularity of flowy skirts and slip dresses, it won't be surprising to see handkerchief hems fill the shelves once again, and it's a trend that I think is great for dressing up or down. Bubble dresses. Moving away from the hippie inspiration, 2023 is going to mark the return of the bubble hem, a trend that I've tried my best to forget. Bubble skirts and dresses date back to the mid-1950s, with designers like Pierre Cardin, Christian Dior, and Hubert Givenchy bringing the style to prominence. It made a comeback in the 1980s, an era known for being big and bold, before returning once again in the aughts, with basically every celebrity sporting a bubble dress at least once. With the 2020s being all about experimentation and drama, we're going to see the bubble silhouette pushed to its limits, taking inspiration from the past while also adjusting it for the present. If it does wind up making a comeback, I'm telling you now, the peplum isn't far behind. Capri pants. Just hearing the words capri pants probably sent a shiver down your spine. And for that, I apologize. While most of us are instantly reminded of the 2000s, the modern equivalent of the trend won't be taking inspiration solely from that era, opting instead for more of a retro look that takes notes from the 1950s and 60s. Capri pants were introduced by Sonia de Lennart in 1948, who came up with the signature length while walking along the beaches in the island of Capri, where her pant legs kept getting wet, and she was inspired to crop them to her ankles. Socialite Bunny Roger would eventually come across Lennart's designs, and his influence in high society helped popularize the pant. And in the 1950s, they were worn by various style icons like Audrey Hepburn, Marilyn Monroe, Brigitte Bardot, and Grace Kelly, starting a capri craze that lasted through the decade. Pedal pushers, also known as clam diggers, were cropped closer to the knee but were similarly trendy during this time period. Both of these shorter lengths continued to be popular until the late 1960s, where they were eventually pushed aside in favor of bell-bottoms. In the late 90s, these crop pants made a return, starting off slim and fitted before becoming more and more baggy as we moved into the 2000s. In 2023, we'll see both silhouettes, although I personally think that the structured and fitted version is more versatile. With this trend making a comeback, I recommend preparing yourself for the inevitable return of cropped leggings. 3D flowers. Best remembered for being worn by Carrie Bradshaw in the TV show Sex and the City, fabric flowers were a major 2000s trend which I myself participated in, so it was kind of inevitable that it would be making a comeback in the 2020s. Like a lot of the other trends that we've discussed, this motif was also popular during the 1930s, 50s, and 80s, and we'll see those influences appear in how fabric flowers are incorporated into garments. Much like the 2000s, we'll also be seeing flower brooches and chokers, which leads me to believe that we're only a few years away from fascinators making a return. While some brands like Loewe have been making hyper-realistic flowers, the vast majority that we'll see in 2023 will be in the rose that got sat on style that is most common. Bow details. In last year's trend prediction video, we mentioned that hair bows would be the next hot fashion accessory, which was correct. And in 2023, we're going to see bows move from the head to other areas, leaving us all looking like Christmas presents. Bow details were popular motifs in the 1950s, 60s, 80s, and 2000s, and the upcoming iteration of the trend will take inspiration from all of those eras, meaning they might be sweet and dainty, or large and eye-catching. With the 80s influence, pussy bow blouses will probably come back into style as well. Oxidized silver. Native Americans have been making jewelry out of silver as early as the 1820s, with different nations having their own techniques, styles, and designs. With hippie style of the 1960s taking so much inspiration from indigenous clothing, I could see silver accessories, especially oxidized silver, making a return. It would also make sense for this to happen considering the current popularity of dainty gold jewelry, and trends often go from one extreme to the other. We've also seen a variety of yeehaw items come into style lately, like bandanas, cowboy boots, and Stetsons, so it was only a matter of time until these Western motifs started to trickle into jewelry trends as well, which means yes, bolo ties will be back. If you happen to be interested in this trend, I'd recommend supporting indigenous artists directly instead of purchasing low-quality knockoffs made by mass retailers. Dip-dyed hair. One of the only trends on this list whose sole inspiration comes from this century. If you were on Tumblr in the early 2010s, then odds are you reblogged at least one photo of someone with dip-dyed hair, and it was seen as edgy, yet extremely normalized. At the time, there were two camps when it came to the colorful dip-dye trend. The more common route was an ombre technique, which gradually segued into your natural hair color, as seen on Demi Lovato, Jessie J, and Kylie Jenner. The other version was more blunt, with the color ending in a sharp line that was more fitting for the hairstyle's dipped name, and this style was spotted on Drew Barrymore, Nicki Minaj, and Gwen Stefani. At the end of the 2010s, we saw the rise of the so-called e-girl hair, which consisted of two dyed strands that framed the wearer's face, and it's become so ubiquitous with trendy online teens that it's been satirized in other media. With e-girl hair becoming so oversaturated, people are on the hunt for the next alternative hair trend, and I think dip dye is the answer they've been looking for. I also think it will be spurred on by Tumblr nostalgia, with the younger generation who missed out on its glory days choosing to relive it however they can. While you might think that this seems a bit far-fetched, both Florence Pugh and Charli XCX have recently sported versions of the dip dye trend. Yoon, the K-pop artist, also received a blunt dip dye in multiple colors, with the dye job highlighting the layers of her hair. While the ombre style is sure to be popular, I think the other version will see more traction than it did the first time around. And instead of pastels, I think the modern interpretation will be bright and bold. The pouf. This trend's roots actually date all the way back to the 18th century, with members of the French court wearing increasingly voluminous hair which was inspired by the Rococo movement. And these hairstyles were incredibly feminine and ornamental. The large hairstyle eventually fell out of favor in the late 1700s, for obvious reasons, and remained out of fashion for an entire century. It saw a brief resurgence in popularity in the late 1800s because of the Gibson girl, who was thought to represent the feminine ideal of physical attractiveness, and women's hair grew large once again. Big hair's next big moment was in the 1960s, when hairstyles like the beehive, pompadour, and bouffant were all the rage, being worn by Jackie Kennedy, Priscilla Presley, and Brigitte Bardot. In the 2000s, we saw a toned-down version of these 1960s hairstyles, with the pouf, or the bump, suddenly appearing on the heads of all of our favorite celebrities. Coming in varying heights and sizes, the pouf was constructed by teasing one's hair in order to create more volume, then combing more hair on top of that to create a smooth surface. Amy Winehouse and Snooki were probably the most faithful to the 1960s, whereas other celebrities simply pinned their bangs to the top of their heads. Bella Hadid, Addison Rae, and Matilda Djerf have already recreated the iconic 2000s pouf. And with everyone's curtain bangs starting to grow out, I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of it. With films that reference the 1960s like Don't Worry Darling, Last Night in Soho, and Elvis being released, I also wouldn't be surprised if beehives and bouffants become popular. High fashion hoods. The 1970s have had a lot of influence over fashion trends of the 2020s, with flared pants, sequins, and platform shoes all seeing a resurgence in popularity, and this pattern won't be stopping anytime soon. As we move into 2023, we'll start seeing some more disco-era trends, including the high fashion hood, which was popularized in the 1970s by American fashion designer Halston. Halston's hooded dresses were inspired by the popular sportswear trend of the era, and these ensembles were equally sporty and chic. The trend continued into the 1980s, and high fashion hoods were famously worn by actress and singer Grace Jones, who was known for her distinctive androgynous appearance, which the trend played into. While hoods are most commonly associated with the disco era, it also had a brief stint of popularity during the late 1930s into the early 1940s, with these designs taking inspiration from the mysterious and regal cloaks of earlier centuries. Both the 1930s and 1970s are remembered for their glitz and glamour, and this societal shift was actually in response to hardships of their respective time periods. Following catastrophic events like the Great Depression or the Vietnam War, fashion, as well as culture as a whole, became more lively and ostentatious in order to help the public forget about the problems that had plagued them the last few years, allowing them to focus on something pretty instead. Keeping this in mind, it's hardly a surprise that we've seen fashion in the 2020s be similarly used as a form of escapism, with clothing becoming increasingly bold and experimental in the wake of the pandemic. Whether it was on the runway or on red carpets, high fashion hoods made frequent appearances in the latter half of 2022, and they'll only continue to be popular in 2023. Gothic glamour. There are quite a few factors at play with this trend, but trust me, it makes sense. Recent trends like the puff sleeve and corset harken back to the Victorian era, the time period when Gothic literature first became a phenomenon. As part of this trend, we'll be seeing deeper colors, velvet, lace details, structured silhouettes, religious iconography, and even veils. I personally blame Mia Goth and Jenna Ortega for this one. Sheer. Underwear as outerwear has been all the rage for decades now, but in 2023 we'll get a new take on the trend. Whether it's mesh, crochet, or lace, the sheer trend is perfect for layering, and is incredibly versatile. Now, before you get frightened by the concept, you get to decide how much skin you want to show, and if that's none at all, just wear your sheer pieces on top of your outfits to add more dimension. If you are bold, take it back to the 90s with a sheer dress and make your underwear an accessory. Polka dots. Over the last few years, the fashion industry has been experimenting with abstract and psychedelic prints to an extent that could rival the 1970s. But in 2023, we'll start to see things toned down a bit, with simpler patterns becoming more common. With all of the past influences on today's trends, I'd bet that the next big print is going to be polka dots. Although the pattern has been around for centuries, I personally associate it most with the 1950s and 1980s, which makes it feel retro yet somehow timeless. If you're looking to have some fun with your spots, consider mixing things up by incorporating multiple sizes or colors of polka dots into a single outfit. Statement stripes. Instead of all of the wiggly and wavy lines that we've been seeing, in 2023 things are going to straighten out, but they'll be just as bold as ever. Whether they're vertical or horizontal, thin or thick, stripes are going to be everywhere. Cargo pockets. Designed in the 1940s as military workwear, cargo pants were originally created for tough environments and outdoor activities, and were named after the large flap pockets which became the trend's identifier. For decades, they were primarily used for their intended purpose, until the 1990s when they became a more fashionable piece of clothing as a direct result of 90s youth counterculture. They eventually became a staple of the early 2000s, often being found in camouflage, khaki, or dark green as an ode to its military roots. As trends changed, so did popular opinions on cargo pants, and it became quite common to poke fun at them, with most jokes being directed at their overt utilitarianism. In the late 2010s, cargo pants made a small return as part of the 90s revival, but their true rise to prominence was the 2020s, where they became a full-blown trend as a result of the 2000s comeback. What will make 2023 unique is that cargo pockets will no longer be reserved strictly for pants, showing up on everything from skirts to jackets to purses, and we'll also see them in a wider range of colors and fabrics. The popularity of cargo pockets and other pragmatic motifs is largely the result of the growing utilitarianism trend, a style which combines traits from menswear and military wear, resulting in a look that is both functional and fashionable. I credit the recent resurgence of utilitarianism to the pandemic. After all, what could inspire more people to be as prepared as possible than a literal doomsday scenario? What trends are you most looking forward to in 2023? I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye!